Hello everyone, it's so great to see you all again and welcome back. Two sessions back we looked at the way certain evil groups seem to be trying to recreate conditions in the world that resemble those that existed shortly before the flood of Noah, including the mastery of genetic code and its use to increase food yields and resurrect extinct species of animal preserved in their seed, their blood, their bone or other available DNA. This includes the resurrection of errant seed, such as that of the giants, and the whole Jurassic Park thing, which is man toying with the idea of trying to bring back even the dinosaurs. Occultists have their own evil reasons for wanting this technology, and super soldiers and powerful psychics are only the beginning. Their motives also reach into providing a service for the alien hosts who are helping them with technology and providing a way for them to resurrect their own children, the giants, and provide them with superior new bodies, and a kind of immortality through cloning going forward. The same technologies will also promise the elitists, the future controllers in the New World Order, a superior life. One YouTube video recently claimed that the first person to be 1,000 years old is alive today. Now, among things they seek to resurrect are the fallen civilization of Atlantis, which in a way they are doing already. This new Atlantis, this resurrection of the old order, in defiance of heaven, is the occultist dream of the re-persecution of the Atlantean war against the old gods, which it thinks it may, with modern technology, now have a chance of winning. Such a victory would also free the fallen angels from the great judgment day they otherwise face. It is a Nimrod-like policy of preemptive strike against heaven, which some people believe was also among the intended functions of the Tower of Babel in the first place. Or to put it all in biblical terms, the New World Order is another form of the Tower of Babel society. In our last two sessions, in attempting to dispel the notion that this was all just so much science fiction, we provided some powerful proof that giants really did exist, and that the biblical account in Genesis 6, where the sons of God married with the daughters of men, was not just some biblical mythology mirroring Greek mythology, but an account of real events and a real horror story on the earth. We also noted that the angels, in their banishment, very probably took their wives with them, and this would have meant that human structures had to be built on the moon and elsewhere. If the fallen angels attempted to move off planet, we do not know if any giants also made the move, but possibly they did. Ancient ruins of human-like dwellings on the moon and Mars seem to confirm that people at one time lived there, but the ruins also indicate that some sort of war might have taken place in space for obscure reasons. Reports by Apollo astronauts of encountering manufactured debris and spacecraft parked on the moon, and the remnants of ancient buildings placed a great hush on the space program, which also terminated prematurely, as did the idea of this extended space station. What followed was the joint Russian and American Apollo 20 mission with its recovery in 1982 or thereabouts of an undecayed female human pilot, among other bodies that were also found there. Now, she was found in a huge vehicle about 3.4 kilometers long that seems to have been either attacked by weapons or battered by asteroids while parked on the moon. At this stage, I'm still accepting this finding as genuine, so this would at least seem to confirm that women were also on the moon and that the story of the banished angels was likely to be true. One wonders what became of this woman, whose body was intact enough to make her a possible candidate for the kind of reanimation that the shadow government technologists are trying to master for themselves. Her DNA, of course, would be of great interest to them because it was relatively fresh to the creation. At the very least, her DNA, which should be a lot better than ours, is available to them. Given then that we appear to be in a period in which great historical secrets are being exposed one after the other, with a reawakening of ancient occult mysteries, it seems time to consider how all of this now relates to the Antichrist and the false prophet and the great technology-based deception of the last days. And we are told by Paul that it will be a great deception that's coming, with all manner of lying wonders by the power of Satan himself, according to Paul. One also wonders about the good alien, bad alien game that's being played, and all the stories about how some are good and some are bad that are being circulated by different voices on the in the media, and how to stay discerning in the event of any alien disclosure. How do we know whether to fight or not to fight, to align or not to align with any so-called alien invader? We've decided so far that any alien is a bad alien. In the literature, one can read of the Galactic Federation of Light, for instance, and its efforts to help the Earth to find political peace. But this name smacks of Hollywood and New Ageism. Certainly a very human name for such a federation, and probably not the sort of name you'd expect some aliens to be going around with. But it appears to be a cover agency anyway for fallen angels, if we think about it in biblical terms. And these angels have manifested themselves to common folk and world leaders as beautiful Nordic-looking beings. Some of their names are Semi-Azars, Ashtor, Sananda, etc. But these are actually all the names of fallen angels. Semi-Azars is the Book of Esther's Semjaza. Ashtor is the Bible's god behind the demonic worship of Ashtoreth. And Sananda is an ancient Indian deity, probably a giant demigod. These beings always espouse the New Age philosophy and teach that mankind can attain divinity simply through self-discovery. They also espouse world government. Aliens, especially the beautiful Nordics, landed at Helmand Air Force Base and spoke to military leaders in the late 1950s. There was, in fact, a videotape of their UFO flying in and landing, but this was at the last moment pulled from network television release for military security reasons. But for a time, it was given the go ahead and was about to be aired to the public back then. But ever since then, it's remained a secret. But these angels that got off and shook hands with the President of the United States at the time and with military leaders introduced themselves with the names Semi-Azars, Ashtor, Sananda. And as I've said, these are names straight out of the Book of Enoch and the likes. Today we have Steve Greer. He believes that all aliens are basically good, but the government's push the evil alien idea as long as the fake alien invasion plan has to stay up their sleeve. They want any aliens that come in to be evil so that we have to fight them. But as far as Greer is concerned, in fact, the aliens are good. And these good aliens apparently want us to join their Galactic Federation of Light and say that a peaceful world government on Earth would send a good signal to other civilizations in our galaxy. Well, Steve Greer may be telling the truth at one level that there's an attack coming. On the other hand, he may be selling us a New Age doctrine in a very deceitful way. A New World Order doctrine in a very deceitful way. So we have to be careful about what we believe there also. Now, Tom DeLonge is another who believes that all aliens are not good, but in fact are all bad, and that nuclear stockpiles in the 1960s were in fact a military muscle flex to warn the aliens against duplicity in their deals with world earthly-based governments. And since that time, human beings also have laser weapons, so they still have the threat of attacking aliens if the aliens play up. Now, atmospheric tests in 1964 brought down an alien craft by accident at that time, and also several satellites came down, and they produced a radiation belt which persisted around the Earth for 5 years. Project Blue Book then officially ended in 1969, and a series of 8 shows for TV were made about the project in 1973. Video of that Helmand Air Force Base meeting was handed to those TV producers in 1973, but it was blocked moments before it went to air, and the secrecy has been kept ever since, and that's a good 45 years ago. Now, it seems wiser perhaps to assume that any alien is a bad alien, and that they are more closely linked to demons and fallen angels than to our realm of existence. Anyway, biblically speaking, the kingdom of God is run from heaven and from the throne of God, and not from some galactic federation. The nurse who publicized her many conversations with the surviving Roswell alien says that she communicated with that alien telepathically, and in those interviews she learned many things about the alien vision for the world. In November 1989, at 3 a.m., United Nations Security General. This is an interesting story too. It's about abductions. In November 1989, at 3 a.m., United Nations Security General Perez de Cuellar was abducted from a motorcade by aliens. So while he was driving there with cars all around him, he was actually abducted. They threatened to kidnap and disappear any high-up official who thought to publicize ET presence on the Earth. Those abducted believe they are real abductions, but the abduction smacks of a military operation. So, maybe the military actually somehow knocked him out and made him believe he was abducted, and then gave him the message to bring back from the so-called aliens, which was really a military message to stop us probing into military things. Now, perhaps it was the threat of a Trump disclosure that sparked an initiative since January 2016 to get alien disclosure out. Perhaps to preempt Trump so that they could write the new truth before he did. A new Spielberg-produced TV documentary series is set to run for 5 years from 2018 through to 2022, and its central theme is also going to be the disclosure of alien presence on Earth. However, if the Khazarian, that is the Jewish Illuminati, are in charge of this great alien hoax, World War and even the alien invasion will have to wait its turn until Jerusalem's temple is first rebuilt, as that's their primary objective at this time. And they don't want to rock the boat before that's achieved. Now, the first thing one notices from the text of Revelation 13, which claims that the second beast causes fire to fall down from heaven to earth in the sight of men, is that this false prophet wields an Elijah-like power, because this is something Elijah did in the books of Kings, 1 Kings in particular, in the Old Testament. And this false prophet of the last days, which has these miraculous powers, which are probably technologically based powers, possibly based on space technology, is that in the modern world, this technological high priesthood is emulating what the prophet Elijah did in the Old Testament, but it's just a modern version of it. In truth, if this prophecy were literal, the beast would probably be using a space-based laser weapon system. These things are normally kept completely out of sight, and so it can appear like a false miracle, especially if nobody says it was a laser weapon. But of course, we do understand from the book of Revelation that he's not a prophet, but he is the false prophet. So everything he does is false. It's a lie, and it's a deception. Now, his God, of course, is not a deity such as attended Elijah, but the God of the false prophet is actually man himself, as Paul makes clear. And the man of sin sits in the temple of God, claiming he himself as a man is God. And it's to this God, this man, that the false prophet is bearing witness. So there would, as there is in any case, some tension created for the Antichrist beast if he falsified a supernatural sign here and cast down the notion of a supernatural elsewhere. So if the man of sin does not believe in the supernatural, does not believe in the idea of a god and the gods, but that everything was just some sort of ancient technology, then he could not claim that these signs by the second beast, the false prophet, were supernatural either, because that would be in contradiction to his belief that there was no such thing as the supernatural. So the only compromise then, and the only way we could interpret what is being done here by the second beast, would be that it was a technological feat. The only, aside from that, we could maybe possibly postulate that he could claim it was the god Lucifer himself that had either literally or figuratively sent this fire from heaven when the people on earth had invoked his name. And so in that sense, it could be considered the supernatural sign of a different god. Now, the fact that there's also a great tribulation that begins here, and the fact that Jesus warns that this will be the fiercest persecution of all time, indicates that a whole new philosophy is being introduced to the world that will not in the smallest degree tolerate dissenters. And it's always the way that when a state power wants to put down its stamp of authority, and then the church wants to raise up its resistance to that the persecution is particularly fierce. And so in this case, where they're trying to cast out Christianity and Judaism altogether and replace it with worship of Lucifer, one can understand why it will be probably the worst persecution of all history. It is conceivably the public introduction of the Luciferian doctrine that requires these false signs from heaven, and which may have been invoked at the hailing of Lucifer's name. The Jerusalem temple, after all, was inaugurated with fire descending over the temple as the name of the biblical god Jehovah was invoked. And we can read this in the history of Solomon. Now, Lucifer in this new religion is likely to impersonate some sort of a sign like this, because this was always accepted as the mark of divine election, the sign of who now rules the heavens. So for the Christian, it's different. The sign of, say, lightning falling from heaven, as it says in Revelation 13, can also be read as denoting the beginning of the overthrow of Satan. We know that Jesus said to his disciples when they returned from their successful mission, where they were rejoicing that people had received their message and they had done miracles and cast out demons, and Jesus responded by saying, I have seen Satan fall from heaven as lightning. And so that this rising up of the power of the church over the power of the world is actually symbolized by the lightning falling from heaven to earth. Now, of course, in the world they can spin this tale and say this is a sign of Lucifer's inauguration if they can time the two things together effectively. Now, the Christian church in these days will not cower, but will react proactively against such a move and become vocal in opposition. And the beast will almost be forced to launch his great persecution against them just to quieten them down. And I should mention in passing, of course, that in Aramaic, actually, Jesus could have said, I have seen Satan fall as Barack Obama, because apparently the name Barack Obama in Aramaic means lightning that falls from heaven. So, and indeed, Obama's rule could be perhaps considered to be a signal to the satanic world that the time of their emergence into power was supposed to take place. It was coded in his very name. However, things, as we know, have turned in a different direction with God's hand on the Trump public ministry at the moment. So, given the signs of the times today, the church now has to stand up and not cower, but understand that God is empowering them to take up their call against this lying satanic world government that's trying to emerge and express itself. The fiercest persecutions have always occurred when societies have been in the very midst of their revolutions, for example, at the beginnings of the socialist revolutions in both Russia and China. And the Roman persecution was also worst, as emperors began insisting that their statues be worshipped. To make this the fiercest persecution of all time, the degree of change suggested must in some distinctive way be greater than anything seen before, and could be something as radical as the abolition of all religion and its replacement with the enforced worship of Lucifer. Now, today's study is going to look at what might be meant by the lying wonders that Paul speaks of and that the false prophet does. And what will the return of those fallen angels look like when they're released briefly before the end of the world? Among other things, we will consider the significance of modern reports of giants that have been found in stasis chambers in mountain hideaways, and the ancient doctrine of the spirits of the giants as being the origin of the New Testament's demons. And in that area too, we'll be looking at the idea of can bodies that have been preserved well enough be reanimated in our age? Because if we are talking about aliens and clones and step-in spirits that animate those clones, then can we not also reanimate these sleeping giants? We'll look at a few items in the amazing collection of the late Salesian monk, Father Carlos Crespi, also of Ecuador, and what they indicate to us, and at the dangers of the current Illuminati control of the human genome. So let's make a start and see where this takes us. So technically, after this introduction, the session actually starts here. It's session 31, Giants, part 4. And we start as usual with the scripture from Genesis 6. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, they took wives, and they begat giants. And from there, all our troubles began. Now, the technology they provide, these aliens and these spirits, that people are having some sort of contract with, whether they're occult forces or whatever they are providing technology, and this technology allows the false prophet in Revelation 13 to effectively cause fire to fall from heaven to earth in the sight of men. And we know in the Elijah story that the Baal prophets were trying to make this happen, but it never happened. But with modern technology, they probably can make it happen, even if it's a fake miracle, even if it's just lasers from space firing down their beams. I don't think Elijah ever had this at his disposal. In his case, it was a true supernatural manifestation from God that consumed his offering and showed that God was in fact the true God in the world, and not the God of the prophets Baal of Baal. Now, Elijah actually brought fire down from heaven 3 times. Twice it occurred for the groups of 50 soldiers that were sent to arrest him. The third group was wise enough not to demand that he come with them, but to ask nicely, which he did, and then he was faced with the 450 prophets of Baal. He was rabbinically considered as more than a prophet. He was more like a super prophet, approaching the level of Moses or Jesus. And as such, he was also considered to be one who understood mysteries, and as one who could reveal mysteries as well, a master of spiritual power and knowledge. The false prophet will also come as a possessor of and a revealer of mysterious spiritual knowledge and power, and may seem like a kind of Elijah. He will certainly be an occult master, and he may derive his apparent power over nature from this one thing. The angels, who are fighting for their lives, need to carry out the great deception through this man, and need to provide mankind with the technological tools to both gain control of society and to wage a war against Christ that they could hope to win. And this is the ultimate deal maker for this false prophet, who then gains the allegiance of the fallen angels, who, in these next 2 decades, will be released around the world. According to Daniel 11:38, the Antichrist will worship the god of forces. Perhaps this word mahuzim, it's hard to know exactly what it is. The Hebrew people themselves struggle with its exact meaning. It can be forces or fortresses, they believe. But who or what exactly is this god of forces or fortresses? Well, in the modern world, we could say that the god of forces could be the god of technology. It could be the god of the natural forces, which we harness through our technology. Or it could be the harnessing of forces for military power, so therefore a god of weapons. Or a god of nature, even nature that provides these abilities to be harnessed for human use and for human power. But certainly also it's a god of occult force. So one of these meanings of the god of forces is meant, or perhaps more than one, perhaps even all of them. So we can cover it all as the god of all forces if we like. It's this knowledge and power over natural forces that allows the second beast, whose spokesman is the Antichrist, the kingdom of Satan and all its spokesmen, to perform his lying wonders on its behalf. And so the world will sell its world superstate to the peoples of the world with demonstrations of the technology that they also wield. And so it will be a great harbinger in the sense of what they believe can be done in the future with all this technology they now have in their hands. So Paul speaks of these lying wonders in 2 Thessalonians 2:9, and he says, the coming of the lawless one, this is the man of sin, will be in accordance with how Satan works. In other words, it will come with lots of lies and false accusation. He will use all sorts of displays of power through lying signs and wonders. So they are signs and wonders, but the effect of them is that they tell lies. They reinforce some false philosophy or doctrine. The signs are lying because they support a testimony that Jesus is not the Son of God. They cause men to believe the false prophet is as much a god as any that went before. Peter speaks of the devil as transforming himself into an angel of light. which is a kind of satanic transfiguration. The book of Enoch spoke of the fallen angels as being able to transform themselves into multiple forms, to deceive men into believing in many gods. The angels used their powers in ancient times to cause men to worship deities. These demons, who in most cases were the spirits of deposed pre-flood kings, took up residence in the sanctuaries of these false gods. In the last days, every one of these lies will be repeated, but the Lord over all such spirits will be Lucifer himself, and the primary focus of worship will be the dragon and the first beast, which in simplest form comes about through the self-aggrandizement of the spirit of man. The end of the Eden story is not that man is turned from worship of God to worship of knowledge, or even, in its many forms, to worship of the devil, but that he ends up at the end of time in worship of himself. There will be specific miracles that direct primary worship to the first beast, the spirit of Lucifer, but these also support the doctrine that man himself is God, as the Antichrist also declares in the temple of God. Paul says he sits there proclaiming himself to be God. He promotes an age-old lie, the lie that man can tap into a source somewhere deep within him, or somewhere deep in the natural world, but certainly in his natural and psychic person, and stored within the spirits of nature, which also have some sort of psychic resonance with man, that allows the man to perform signs like those performed by Jesus Christ. They just portray Jesus as some sort of a psychic master. And then afterwards, perhaps that history rewrote the works of Jesus Christ as those of the God of Israel. This will be part of their lie. It seeks to reclassify the works of Jesus Christ and make them the works of any man who knows the secret doctrine. It seeks therefore to deny that Christ carries any unearthly anointing at all, such as might confirm that he was the Son of the Heavenly Father, and receives approval from the divine Spirit because of righteousness and divine election. It's a spirit that seeks to denigrate and displace Christ, and to say that he is in fact not a Christ. It is, plain and simple, the humanistic spirit of anti-Christ. Because the deception will run so close to the thoughts and desires of the human heart, it will be easy to accept and hard to resist. The whole human race will be facing the temptation of Eve all over again, and it will succumb to itself, as its own great psyche speaks back to it as if it were an external voice. The pride of Satan, the pride of life, is man's own pride. Mankind, like Eve, identifies with Satan and follows him. To identify is to take identity with, to receive one's name with. It means to receive 666 upon one's brow, and the devil's insignia, one of the meanings of mark, as one's own insignia. Man will believe he is cut out for better things, higher possibilities, greater power over nature and the future, the chance to go to the stars, the chance to become a creator in his own right, the chance to find technology to help him to live forever. Mankind, like Satan, will suffer from delusions of grandeur, but in truth, like King Nebuchadnezzar, he will be clinically insane. So how, having said all of this, will a man be able to discern between a true miracle and a false one? False miracles versus true miracles. Which is which? What is the test of authenticity? Well, the test is simple enough, biblically speaking. The test requires the following questions to be answered. At least these are the questions that have to be answered for the Christian. First of all, do the miracles and messages glorify the Father? What message, what gospel do they endorse? Do they support vengeance or do they support grace? Do they invoke obedience to the Bible? Do they understand the Bible to be the Word of God even? Now, we speak of the return of the fallen angels, but what does this look like? Will we see them come fluttering down from the sky? I suspect not. We will know the moment from the events that follow quickly after. The events that follow quickly after the re-emergence of these angels from their various prisons. It will locate us at the opened abyss of the fifth apocalyptic trumpet. A rapid series of events will follow immediately from the release of these angels from their restraints. The army of demons seen at that trumpet may also correspond to a planned fake alien invasion. The first sign will probably be the seating of the Antichrist in the temple in Jerusalem. The fall of Jerusalem and the manifestation of Satan, of Lucifer, will probably happen at the same time as these angels are released. The Catholic Church may fall to Islam shortly after this. Powers in heaven will move, and great physical signs will be seen in heaven. There will be great cosmic disturbances that correspond to these great spiritual disturbances. The order in the heavens will be disrupted, just as the order in the earth is about to be disrupted. And the Holy Spirit will also fall in new and massive power on the church, but divisions will also form within the church as the empowered church sheds the old skin from its back and has to make a breakaway from the traditional and largely spiritless church that is trying to hold to power. Now, if the return of these fallen angels is not seen as a public spectacle, what will it look like? How can anyone know the angels have actually returned? Well, Jesus warns, in fact, that even the elect will be deceived in these days, but it's unclear about how many levels this deception is going to apply on. Firstly, the fallen angels might not appear visibly as angels. It may not be in their interest to do so. This would perhaps be too obvious. So they might use human bodies that have been prepared for them in laboratories, or perhaps even walk-in bodies provided by high-end occultists who have offered themselves as mediums. And perhaps even the clones of world leaders will be taken over by the fallen angels, and the world leaders themselves taken out and replaced by these angel-inhabited clones. So we'll see a dramatic change occurring in the thinking and speech of world leaders, which will be a sign perhaps that they have been taken over. So we're talking here about human bodies that have been prepared for them ahead of time in laboratories, and that must be happening already then, or perhaps even walk-in bodies provided by high-end occultists who have offered themselves as the mediums. If using lifeless bodies, the fallen angels will already have pre-equipped men with the technological know-how of how to create such bodies and then to animate them as walk-in spirits. So, to be clearer about this, there appear to be three cases of walk-ins, one harder than the other, but all possible. The first is the hardest and is effectively a resurrection, where a body that is dead or in stasis but has been preserved in perfect biological order can be reanimated by a spirit that is not its original spirit. In this way, the fallen angels could perhaps reanimate some of those giants that have been found in stasis and bring them back to life, in a sense living inside the bodies of their own earthly seed. Now, the second is a mind control situation where a person has their own spirit, but that spirit can be brought under a kind of hypnotic trance by a variety of programmed triggers, which might include keywords or musical notes or hand gestures, so that a walk-in spirit can take control and use that body for its own purposes for designated periods of time. When the spirit of the original owner of that body, their spirit is put into a kind of a sleep, is switched off for a time. In fact, this is a classic mind control trick, not too far separated from hypnosis, for instance, and is also used with super soldiers in the army who kill and do not remember what they did, where a person's own spirit has fallen under control after prolonged abuses of one sort or another and has succumbed to deep hypnotic suggestions and permissions for walk-in spirits to operate on cue or when necessary, and then to leave the body when their task is done. And this is something people could research for themselves, this whole idea of using people who kill without any feelings about it or even without any memory. Now, the third kind of walk-in is a kind of permanent resident walk-in, and this kind of spirit could have been implanted in a child, perhaps as the result of an occult ritual, or just born into the child because of the mother's own role in the occult, so that from the moment of conception, the spirit was basically present in the mother's own body, ready to be born with the child. The spirit of divination that is implanted in mediums is often received during an occult ritual of invocation. An ex-illuminist will testify of being offered various walk-in spirits to give them success in their chosen worldly venture, and they speak of witnessing such spirits actually manifesting to them simply by walking out of walls. These spirits can, pass through walls and in and out of bodies as as they see fit, given that the occultists give them the permission to do that. But ordinarily, they should not be allowed to do that. Now, the people afterwards feel themselves to have a spiritual gift which will operate as they enter certain states of mind. We know from our experience of spiritual gifts as Christians that such spiritual gifts can live within us also without necessarily taking over our everyday lives. But sometimes these giftings and these spirits come upon us just when they have to, and we sometimes wonder how we did what we did. And it's just not there all the time. It just appears when it's necessary. And this could be the case also in the occult world. But this all has to be done with permission given ahead of time. And this, of course, is part of the deals made with the occultists with the dark spiritual forces. Of course, there's always the possibility that these angels will simply manifest themselves openly as human beings. The fact that they married and had children in Genesis 6 tells us that they are also capable of doing this, and they're still able to hide themselves even if they choose this method. But it seems to me that this is the most actually uncomplicated way of doing things, and it's probably the method they will choose. But of course, all of these methods are in fact available to them. Now, there is one Jewish source that makes a claim that not all fallen angels were actually sent into imprisonment, and that the punishing and testing angel Mastema, who seems to have all the attributes of Satan and is an angel of disaster, requests from God at the time the angels are judged and locked up that some, in fact 10%, of the fallen angels might remain free to help God with his work as a punisher for those whom God wishes to punish. And apparently they are given this permission. But we only find this in the book of Jubilees at chapter 10, verses 8 and 9. This figure of 10% represents about 20 of the original 200 angels, who seem to be given some freedom then to serve the purposes of Satan in the world, as Satan serves the purposes of God, as much as anything else in the fulfilling of prophecy and the bringing of the world to its climax. Now it says there in Jubilees 10, and the chief of the spirits, Mastema, came and said, Lord, Creator, let some of them remain before me, and let them hearken to my voice, and do all that I shall say to them, for if some of them are not left to me, I shall not be able to execute the power of my will on the sons of men, for these are for corruption and leading astray before my judgment, for great is the wickedness of the sons of men. You see, they're making an argument here that men are just as wicked as the angels, and so why should the angels be fully judged and not the men? So the angels are now offering their services to God in bringing evil upon the men, just as the angels themselves are receiving evil at the hand of God. And it's kind of an interesting deal. And he said, let the 10th part of them remain before him, and let 9 parts descend into the place of condemnation. Now, this detail is missing from other texts related to this topic. So one could argue that it is, in fact, uncorroborated, and I would have to concede that, but let's run with it anyway. It seems that a tenth of the fallen angels, which is 20 of them, remained on earth to lead men astray, and we can compare 2 Thessalonians 2 on this point. And it says in the book of Jubilees, and we did according to all his words, all the malignant ones we bound in the place of condemnation, so the worst of them, and a 10th part of them we left, that they might be subject to Satan on the earth. But even if these angels are running around in the world, Christians, through having Christ's authority, retain total authority over these condemned angelic spirits. Various sicknesses were also attributed to these evil angels, and special knowledge was then required to fend off these sicknesses or to expel demons. A lot of the ancient sicknesses were in fact attributed to the afflictions of spirits. And this may sound like an antiquated old idea, but it's actually based on a knowledge that the spirits of the demons were still around. Now, there was apparently a book written by Noah and handed to Shem that outlined the cures to the various diseases that had befallen mankind since the fall. Noah attributed many of these diseases to the spirits of the deceased giants, which were now wandering the earth looking for human bodies to live in. Many diseases were understood as arising because these spirits had permanently or temporarily entered the bodies of men, or had otherwise sent an affliction to them. Their presence in the human body had caused a disturbance there, which had brought on the sicknesses. And we explained to Noah all the medicines of their diseases, together with their seductions, how we might heal them with herbs of the earth. And Noah wrote down all things in a book that, as we instructed him, concerning every kind of medicine. And thus the evil spirits were precluded from hurting the sons of Noah. And he gave all that he had written to Shem, his eldest son, for he loved him exceedingly above all his sons. And after this, Noah slept with his fathers, and was buried on Mount Lubar in the land of Ararat, which of course is where the Noah's Ark came down, modern Turkey. 950 years he completed in his life, 19 jubilees in 2 weeks and 5 years. So Noah being 600 at the flood means he lived for another 350 years afterwards as well. And it's quite interesting that it tells us how many jubilees had passed, because it allows us to count back and figure out when the jubilees began, which doesn't turn out to be in the time of Adam, but in the time of his son Seth. And in this life on earth he excelled the children of men, save Enoch, because of his standards of righteousness, wherein he was perfect. But Enoch's office was ordained for a testimony to the generations of the world, and we are those generations that now are receiving his testimony, so that he should recount all the deeds of generation unto generation until the day of judgment, so that none of us would forget why the day of judgment was set in place and what it's going to achieve. Now, the latter enmity between Israel and the Canaanites traced not only to the differences between Yahweh worship and Baal worship, or to Canaanite rejection of Jehovah, but it also traced to Canaan's disobedience to his own grandfather Ham. Now, according to the book of Jubilees, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the 3 sons of Noah, had received lots from Noah to decide which areas of land they would occupy, and this was considered to come from the hand of God himself. God was considered to drive the fate of these people, and therefore the lots that they would choose. Ham's grandson Canaan, however, decided to occupy the coastlands running from Egypt to Syria, which had in fact been given by lot to Shem. This therefore lies behind God's later directive for Israel to drive the Canaanites from the land and to possess the land, because in fact it already is their possession by lot. Now from Jubilees 10:27 and onwards, it says, "In the 4th week, in the 1st year, in the beginning thereof, in the 34th Jubilee," so we're talking about 430 Jubilees now, 34 Jubilees, "were they dispersed from the land of Shinar. And Ham and his sons went into the land which he was to occupy, which he acquired as his portion in the land of the south. And Canaan saw the land of Lebanon to the river of Egypt, that it was very good, and he went not into the land of his inheritance to the West Sea," which is obviously along the coast of the Mediterranean. "But he dwelt in the land of Lebanon, eastward and westward from the border of Jordan, and from the border of the sea. And Ham his father, and Cush and Mizraim his brothers, said to him, Thou hast settled in a land that is not thine, and which did not fall to us by lot. Do not do so, for if thou dost do so, thou and thy sons will fall in the land and be accursed through sedition. For by sedition ye have settled, and by sedition will thy children fall, and thou shalt be rooted out forever." And of course we see the whole problem today with Israel-Palestine, the Palestinians forever laying claim to this land, and God forever saying to them, this land has been given to Israel, stop persecuting the Jews and stop trying to claim their land. And of course we know at the end of the age that there will be the Islamic forces, which are in a way a derivative from these forces of Canaan, that will lay final claim to the land and will finally be destroyed in the day of Armageddon, once and for all. And it continues in Jubilees 10, "Dwell not in the dwelling of Shem, for to Shem and to his sons did it come by their lot. So therefore cursed art thou, and cursed shalt thou be beyond all the sons of Noah, by the curse by which we bind ourselves by an oath in the presence of the holy judge, in the presence of Noah our father. But he did not hearken unto them, and dwelt in the land of Lebanon from Hamath to the entering of Egypt, he and his sons, until this day, which is probably about 400 BC when this was written, I suppose. And for this reason, that land is named Canaan, because it was named after the ancestor Canaan, who was a son of Cush, Ham, Cush, Nimrod. Yeah, it was one of the of Cush, which comes out of Ham. Now, firstly, a few comments about the text, which are kind of interesting, and we'll just throw them in. The year of the 34th Jubilee happens to be the 1700th year then, since Jubilees began, because a Jubilee is every 50 years. So 34 lots of 50 is 1700 years, which means that these events occurred 1700 years after Jubilees began on the earth. Now, Nimrod, being the sixth grandson of Ham, must have been born 60 to 70 years after the flood, and would have been about 40 when he began to establish a kingdom in Shinar and build the Tower of Babel. Now, the way Genesis 5:5 tells it, Adam's first son is Seth, and mankind begins with him. There was a false start, if you like, with Cain and Abel. Abel was killed and Cain fled away, so God had to start again with Seth. And so if there'd been any Jubilees before that, they would have been written off, and it would have started with Seth. And so the counting of the cycle of festivals probably starts with Seth, who was in fact born 130 years after Adam's creation. So if we count 1700 years from the birth of Seth, the 34th Jubilee indicates that Babel event would have been then 174 years after the flood on that reckoning. Now we have to sort of see if that would sort of work out. Could it be that the Tower of Babel was really finished at about 174 years after the flood? Well, let's have a look. If Ham begets Canaan shortly after God's command to go forth and multiply at Genesis 9:1 given through Noah, then Canaan would begin begetting children about 40 years after the flood. The sixth of his children is Nimrod, who is therefore born somewhere maybe approaching Canaan's 60th year. Perhaps as late as 70th, but let's call it 60th year. 100 years after the flood, with Nimrod now about 40 years old, he begins to raise an army and begins to build 6 fortified cities in the plain of Shinar, which would have taken him decades. And we know that he did build 6 fortified cities. So I imagine he must have been about 100 years old by the time all of this construction work was finished, which would have been somewhere near 160 years after the flood. Only then did he decide that what it still needed was a great ziggurat tower extending to heaven, and the Tower of Babel project would have begun then. And so, if this took 10 or 12 or 13 years, the scattering of the people about 174 years after the flood therefore seems very tenable, and does seem to identify not the creation of Adam, but the birth of Seth as the beginning point for the world's religious calendars. In passing, it does allow us to do a quick check of where significant events fall in the cycles of Jubilees, and this will be a rough guide, but we can then sort of look at the rest of history and see how they corresponded more or less to this cycle of Jubilees. Let's have a look at it now. If Abraham is born 474 years after the flood, and therefore near 1970 BC, which is about the right date, but it means we have to add about 100 years somewhere in the genealogy as we see it in the Bible. This would place it about 2,000 years after Seth's birth, and therefore at the 40th Jubilee. 1,000 years later, then at 970 BC, which is when the Temple of Jerusalem is going to be dedicated by Solomon, would make it the 60th Jubilee. 1,000 years more, and now at the 80th Jubilee, is when Jesus is crucified and resurrected. And 2,000 years later, at around 2028 AD, it will of course be the 120th Jubilee. Canaan took the land from Shem, who had won the land by lot rightfully, and therefore Shem was displaced, and part of his inheritance was stolen. He didn't lose all of his inheritance, but he lost that part of it. And we find that Shem was basically displaced across to modern Iran and Iraq, and that Abraham then migrated from Mesopotamia, Iraq, back toward Canaan to claim for God to claim that land back through his seed. So the land that was rightfully Canaan's was over towards the Mediterranean coast and Africa and West Africa, the lands of the West. Now, the book of Jubilees tells a story of his brothers pronouncing him cursed for all time if he would not relinquish the land awarded by Lot and thus by God to the children of Shem, who include, of course, Abraham. So naturally it was written by the Jews, but God selects the Semite Abraham and commands him to leave Chaldea and head back towards the land of Canaan, which God is wanting for him to possess, and we could possibly say repossess. Now, even God is standing by the lots drawn by Noah, and rather than make Abraham great right where he is in Mesopotamia, he starts on a long-term plan to drive the Canaanites from their land and give it back to its rightful owner, Shem, through Abraham. And Abraham is the branch of Shem through whom he will achieve it. And Genesis 12:1-2 is the call to go and head back toward Canaan. Now, spiritually, the church is also sent to go and recover the land of Canaan, so to speak, from those who have stolen it. The empires of the world have stolen the earth and its government from the kingdom of God, to whom it actually by right belongs after Jesus Christ rose from the dead. However, it is interesting that it is in this land that is not properly owned by Canaan, which he is also told by father and brothers to hand back to Shem's children, that the curses of the giants appear. So this great satanic curse appears in the very land which has been stolen from the people of God, just as the modern plague of Satanism has taken over the world's governments, which should by rights have been the kingdom of God. Now, this seed of the giants is strongest historically in the biblical history in the seed of Ham's wife and in her children. And 6 full tribes of giants appear in the land of Canaan after the flood, and evidently without the sons of God again taking wives from the daughters of men. So we don't think that the angels came down again and did it all over again, but the genes, the genetic remnants that were there in the wife of Ham began to manifest themselves again, especially as these families, perhaps their children that were getting bigger and bigger, began to marry amongst themselves, and people went from 6 to 7 to 9 to 12 feet tall again within a number of generations. So there's also, of course, the possibility, though, that some of the giants actually survived the flood by making their own boats, and it's interesting that the giants are congregated in what we find later all along the coastal strip of Palestine, as if they actually had arrived there on boats, just as the giants did before the flood, and so they continued to do afterwards. They were not able to change their nature or their plans. They just concentrated on surviving the flood and continuing with their plans. So it's possible that some of them survived the flood. They were certainly aggressive, and they made very good warriors. And we have a picture at the back here of some of their, triumphs as they push their spears through people's throats and things. So the 6 families of giants all went on to become local kings and heroes in the land of Canaan, so that when the Jews saw them, they were so scared of them, they came back and reported to Moses that we were like grasshoppers in their sight, and they were just not willing to go and fight them. And Og of Bashan, who later was defeated by the forces under Joshua, was in fact a 10-foot tall giant and the king of Bashan. The biblical record tells us that they have various mutations, in fact, and this may be a further indication that they were marrying mainly among themselves and gathering genetic errors, that were then propagated through continuous intermarriage. For instance, the brother of Goliath had 6 fingers, we're told in the Bible. The men of Canaan generally learnt to get along with the giants. The giants weren't always eating people and killing them, but they certainly were many times using them for slaves. And these giants may have had their own problems and may well have had conflicts one with another, tribal jealousies or, fighting for their patch, as it were. that might have stopped them working together, and that would have weakened them as a strong force in the land. It would have been an Achilles heel, in a sense, to their society. So these things probably worked for the armies of Israel when they came to attack the giants. Now, Israel's armies will find ways to exploit the weaknesses of the giants, and perhaps the giants were not maybe as quick as people on their feet. Maybe they had a speed advantage, or maybe they just mobbed the giants, or maybe they attacked them at a distance. I'm not sure how they did it. But they found ways to exploit them and to attack them and to overcome them. And after defeating the giants in battle, they would drive them northward out of Israel, and in fact, right out over the coasts. And the giants would end up scattering out along the Mediterranean coastlands and regions over time. But they were never actually exterminated. They went on to settle along the African and European coastal strips as they did previously in Canaan. Perhaps they were thinking maybe we can find a way back to Canaan in time. But instead, Israel became stronger and stronger, and the giants went the other direction and ended up making long journeys that brought them in the end to the Americas. And this is where many of them have been discovered today in the burial mounds of Wisconsin, Ohio, and New Jersey. Archaeologists should find that their arrival dates, if they do their calculations properly, should come out at being around about 14 to 1500 BC, which is approximately the time, or shortly after the time, that Joshua was busy expelling them from Canaan. In pre-flood days, the giants had spread themselves extensively around the world, and we find those ruins already, and those megalithic ruins more or less trace their movements in those days, which was pretty much global. They did have 700 years, to be fair, and they probably built great ships, and maybe the land continents were also distributed slightly differently at that time, so that maybe it was easier to get from one continent to another. I don't know, but they did manage to set up kingdoms in Southern America and China, and I don't know about Africa, but certainly in parts of Europe and the Middle East, they were quite widespread. Now, God had another way of weakening their hold on the world's citizens as well, which was to set the giants against each other and to engage them in mutual slaughter. And this was in a way cashing in on the sort of degraded spiritual nature they had, their basic carnal nature. So where the angels maybe had bred with the women, and the women had hoped to gain immortality, instead the children picked up the nature of sinful men, and this was amplified in them. And these battles were triggered from another problem, that was the need for the giants to eat. Of course, they had huge appetites, and the basic competition for available resources in a world that was not really set up to support the appetites of giants was largely their undoing, and they killed each other to get the food they needed. In fact, when they killed each other, they might have done what the Maori did in New Zealand. They may have ended up eating each other, and they wanted to get control of the manpower that could find this food for them. So, of course, they enslaved men and put them to the task of finding food for them. And this sounds rather like the modern philosophy of the Illuminati, who seem to think that most of us are just a working class of ants to produce their luxury and life for them, and to keep their world ticking while they live in the lap of luxury and keep us on the brink of starvation, just as slaves. And this spirit was borrowed from the giants, I'm sure. Now, so to bring us back to the modern day, one of the lying wonders that the fallen angels will do is to present a range of creatures from other star systems that have really been produced on the Earth in laboratories that have been operating since the 1930s, but they'll claim that they were perhaps the remnant of aliens that had visited the Earth historically, and that we're just one other community in a great big cosmic community of worlds. Now, it was also in the same 1930s that German occultists successfully contacted demonic entities who offered them the technology to win the war, this was the Second World War, and take over the world. Well, unfortunately, it didn't quite happen, but the Germans already had a clumsy sort of a UFO during the Second World War called the Bell, if we translate it into English, and they were trying to weaponize it during the Second World War before the tide of the war began to change. And they left the public with the impression that this was as far as they got. But in fact, fleets of German UFOs flew to Antarctica at the end of the war, and probably a few years after the war, they attacked Admiral Byrd during his 1947 expedition with a whole flotilla of ships from the American Navy who were sent to Antarctica to get rid of the last vestiges of the Nazi war machine. But they found themselves attacked by UFOs, and they were thoroughly humiliated and crawled back to America to lick their wounds. Um, it's also believed, actually, in the 50s or so, the Germans were able to take this new technology and even fly to the moon in these craft, and had established a base there in the early 1960s, which we've seen a photograph of in our last session, in fact. If that is, in fact, a German base, but why wouldn't it be? Who else would build the base in the shape of a swastika, unless they're American Nazis? But now, one building that was photographed on the moon during Apollo 11's mission was, as I say, indeed shaped in that form of a swastika. There's also been a building on the Earth in America, in fact. I think it was the NSA building originally was shaped as a swastika before they changed the shape to hide that fact. The more extreme claims made by so-called whistleblowers who once worked in government genetics programs is that the technology is available on Earth, but also on the moon, to manufacture fast-growing human clones. And here's a picture, by the way, of that base on the moon there. And these clones that these government genetics labs have only take about 5 years to go from an embryo to a mature adult form. They have a fast system of growing them. And so these, most of these clones are actually ordered by rich people like kings and queens who, if they get a kidney problem when they're 50 or something, or some other organ, they can then just use the clone as the source of those organs, because of course they're a perfect match for them. But the other way is, if something happens to them, like an accident, if they can save the spirit and transfer it to the new body, then the person can make a full recovery and live on in their cloned form. That's the philosophy behind it anyway. But this same cloning technology has allowed military labs to produce the small alien, grey alien types, the bodies for them. And, the small grey aliens are actually demonic materializations in a way, or they are sort of spirits that take these lab-made bodies to live in. And so they can exist physically as a kind of android. Now, these creatures can fly the UFOs as well on reconnaissance missions through space without having the limitations that the average human being has, and so they're an ideal pilot for space probes. But the laboratories have been far more active than that, and have actually worked hard on animal-animal and animal-human chimeras as well. And this has been going on, full steam for at least 30 or 40 years, maybe even longer, because the Germans were already doing it in the war. Mr. Mengele and people like him were just, when he was experimenting with twins, and it was all his medical experiments and all the things they did. That was only the tip of the iceberg. There was many, many experiments going on, and because they went into sort of secret programs, and they weren't subject to the laws of the land, they just did whatever they wanted, and they've been doing this for 70 or 80 years already. So this kind of thing was going on before the great flood of Noah as well, and so we see that we've returned very literally to the kinds of mentality and spirit of the days of Noah. The secret programs, the secret manipulation of nature, attempts to corrupt the genome or to perfect it on one level, maybe to make it terrible on another, to weaponize it. All these things are there while we have this sort of nice glossy life going on the outside. So anyway, and the spin-off, of course, is the aliens have underground bases where they can do their cloning and produce their armies and workers, their drones as well for their work. The governments can also cash in on that and use some of these to fly their craft on missions outside the Earth-Moon system, look around the solar system, etc. Anyway, not only are they doing animal and animal-human chimeras, they're also trying to produce enhanced forms of human being that can serve the military as super soldiers should the war go into a time of war. And a lot of these super soldiers, they might even be thinking of developing a soldier class in the future, can from the outset, from when these soldiers are, children still, be implanted and programmed so that they can be controlled electronically as well and can't turn on their makers. Now, some of the animal-human chimeras are being passed off as extraterrestrials from a variety of surrounding star systems. And you'll find publications that list as many as 100 different kinds of alien that our governments are talking to. These stories explain that most aliens only come to our neck of the stellar woods to do trade, but one or two species are malignant and evil and pose a threat to us. Sounds scary, and of course it is, if it was true. But right now the US government is passing legislation that describes what courses of action will be justified if the US military meets with enemy super soldiers, zombie apocalypses, flesh-eating monsters, and giant alien invaders. Maybe it's not as crazy as it sounds. It was Werner von Braun who warned that the last step in the great conspiracy, the great lie, would be a fake alien invasion. It's going to be fake because the invasion is planned by our own military, our own Earth-based forces. But it's not fake in the sense of what effect it will have on us. Because there's going to be devastating weapons and monsters that have been produced in human facilities on Earth and on the backside of the moon. The aliens attacking the Earth will just be demons in physical form and under orders from Luciferian elitists. Now, a young boy who recently died and came back 40 minutes later claims he spoke with Jesus and learned that a third world war was coming, during which a terrifying invasion by demon aliens was also coming. He said that was far worse than the war. He claims this attack was much more terrifying than the war, as the aliens also captured humans to eat as food. So there's links available where you can find this. If you look under, for instance, Antarctica plus Nazis, that also has something about this. The articles that you can read about this also warn of 2 asteroid-sized spaceships on their way to Earth, which could be perhaps the repository of these aliens and their craft. I think it's there in the waiting, but it hasn't been given the green light yet for various, perhaps political reasons. But now we turn to the existence of giants in stasis. Now, apparently Abraham Lincoln, who's there in the bottom right, was among those who had the privilege to witness the sight of quite well-preserved giants hidden in a cave system entered by a hole in one side of the Grand Canyon. In Afghanistan, it seems to be quite true that a 15-foot giant was discovered and killed near Kandahar by soldiers who had been sent out into a remote mountainous region to find missing comrades. The giant took some killing, and what looked like human remains at the entrance to its cave suggest the lost soldiers were killed and eaten by the giant. Its presence there suggests that possibly a family of them must exist in the area, or that this giant awoke from a long stasis sleep and was looking for food. Not long after this story, another one broke in Romania. A Vatican official turned up to take charge of the discovery, and information about what was found inside Mount Busagi is now closely controlled. However, the story did get some airtime, and the claim is that several giants were found entombed inside that mountain in a state of suspended animation. There were chambers dug deep into the heart of Romania's Busagi Mountains, where the giants are located. We're speaking here of giants in the order of 18 feet tall. Now, a tunnel running into the mountain's deep interior is said to meet an invisible barrier before a cavern is revealed, containing several tables about 6 feet high, which is appropriate to giants of about 18 feet in height. Now, these tables have large handprints impressed into them as well. And when a hand is placed into the prints, a kind of hologram is said to emerge. These apparently ancient holograms display information that looks like instructions on how to merge animals genetically. The story is probably about 50-50 truth and fancy, but it's certainly very interesting, and no doubt there is some truth behind it. The discovery of giants in the Antarctic excavations is also driving interest in this whole topic, and there's a sketch above of what someone who says they've seen down there. They made a sketch of what they saw. It's not clear what's supposed to bring these giants back to life, but one can only hope that the Illuminati don't get a hold of these giants and start extracting their DNA for cloning purposes. The same fears attached to the quite well-preserved giant body of Gilgamesh found at Uruk in 2003. I, for one, would not be interested in seeing these giants brought back to life, and the oddity here is that the Book of Enoch explains that the spirits of these giants have not received the soul sleep or been transported to paradise after death, but have been condemned to wander the earth as demons until the end of the age. Is there a chance, then, that these bodies, if not degenerated, could be reanimated by the same demon spirits that once inhabited their bodies? The mind boggles. Just to remind ourselves, the giants were the children of human women. But it must have been odd for a 5-foot-something mother to watch a child turn quickly into a 30-foot giant and also find a way to feed it. It would not have been a natural mother-child relationship at all, and the giants would have been rejected by humans as something otherworldly, no less a demon in life as in death. The Book of Enoch claims that the spirits of the conspiring women were also rejected as sirens, which Greek legends describe as seductive spirits that lured sailors to their death. The best way to modernize this is probably to describe them as spirits of sexual seduction, and we might suggest they operate through certain musicians and music videos. The main tool of seduction, according to the Greek legends, was their musical voices. Now we turn to the Book of Enoch briefly. We read there that the giants have sinned against the earth and the animals. So first, they consume everything in sight. Later, they start to manipulate nature. It says in Enoch 10:13, before that, after they manipulate nature, they begin to sin against each other. They unleash bloodshed, war, intimidation, and the giants fight against each other. Now Enoch 10:13 says, and to Gabriel also the Lord said, go to the offspring of the watchers and excite them one against another. Let them perish by mutual slaughter, for length of days shall not be theirs. So God was not going to permit them to last too long. Enoch 7, verses 11 to 14. And the women, conceiving, brought forth giants. So it's pretty clear about what it's saying. It's not that the giants came from nowhere, they came from the women themselves. Now the Greek texts do differ considerably from the Ethiopic text here. One Greek manuscript adds to this section in Enoch, and they, the women that is, bore to them, that is the watchers, 3 races. First, the great giants. The giants brought forth, what some say here, slew, the Nephilim, and the Nephilim brought forth, and again some say slew, the Eliud, and they existed, increasing in power according to their greatness, that is, to their greatness of size. And there's a parallel sort of account given in the Book of Jubilees. So whether they brought forth rather, or slew, it's hard to say, but in any case, there seem to have been 3 different groups. Now Enoch 7:12 continues, says, whose stature was each 3, and then there's missing words, and some people have even put 1,000 there, but I think the words are probably and 20 cubits. Now 23 cubits is like 36 feet. These devoured all which the labour of man produced, until it became impossible to feed them. So Enoch's very explicit about what the problem is. Then they turned themselves against men in order to devour them, and it seems that Enoch is here alluding to cannibalism. And they began to injure which we could translate as damage, or perhaps we mean here genetically damage or manipulate, the birds, beasts, reptiles, and fishes, so that's basically all of the animals, to eat their flesh one after another and to drink their blood. So obviously they were ravenous. And the injury is not necessarily just rounding them up to kill them and eat them, but perhaps even to manipulate them genetically. Does damage mean that they bred these animals into the giants that we recognize today as the creatures of the dinosaur age? Sounds like a pretty good story, but maybe it's really true. We're going to look at a video now. You've seen it before, I think, if you've seen some of the earlier things, just to reassure us that there were giants around. This is the giant footprint in South Africa, called God's Footprint. So here we go.
We are at the famous site of the giant footprint, or the footprint of God, here near Mphaluzi in South Africa, very close to the Swaziland border. Now this is one of the greatest examples of an ancient footprint, a giant footprint about 4 feet high in rough granite. It's between 200 million and 3 billion years old. That's what geologists will tell you. I'm going to just take you, if you follow me, up to the top where it's imprinted against the side of the rock, which means it's been around for so long that the tectonic plates and the movements have actually pushed it up at the apex of this little outcrop. It's quite spectacular, so just walk with me and I'll show you. I don't know of any other example of a footprint in rock that is as amazing as this, and this should be drawing 20 million tourists to South Africa every year, and nobody knows about it. It's unbelievable. There we have it. Let's get closer. Oh wow. This is just beautiful. Look at this. There's the, you know, when you, there's the big toe and the other 4 toes down to the small toe, down to the heel. What's fascinating about this is anybody that does a study of this will notice this piece sticking out here. It's like when you put your foot in mud and you pull it out, your toes will lift up a little mud where your toes were, and that's exactly what seems to have happened here. This rough granite is just, it's pulled up this overhang here. It's spectacular, and I see that people have been visiting here because they've been leaving little coins here, which is wonderful. Maybe just come closer and show this from more close up. Okay, well, I don't know who else has filmed this, but I think we'll put this up for everybody to see, for everyone to really appreciate this. Is a spectacular bit of human history. There were giants on Earth.
Certainly, many ancient tablets depict scenes of giant rulers and diminutive servants, previously thought to be a form of royal art that fanned the ruler's ego by making him much larger than his subjects. But now it seems that the depictions were in fact an accurate record of the relative size of the rulers and the ordinary man. The giants soon made themselves the rulers of men and put humans to work on their behalf. And we can see what the main issue was, which was probably food. And with the help of their parents, the still present angelic watchers who were still looking on at all that was happening, they also became highly intelligent, with the evil part of their nature set loose to create havoc in God's orderly world. Among the things that they were given to understand was the working of genetics, and they were soon skilled at genetic manipulation. Among the things manipulated may have been the dinosaurs, or the animals that turned into dinosaurs, which were made to become large enough that they would be a food supply for the giants. The giants also cut down many, if not all, of the trees. The Crespi collection, Father Crespi was situated in Ecuador. His collection, which is now in a museum, has a few amazing etchings there, where dinosaurs are depicted alive with human beings and with the giants. And where the giants even ride on the dinosaurs like horses. Now just below we see some Egyptian drawings actually, where you see men standing with the same height as a giraffe. You can see the relative height of them. They're at least 20 feet high, I would say. So if we look at one of these Assyrian bas-reliefs, we see here the ruler on the right and his subjects on the left, and you see if he was to stand up, they would not be much above his knee height, which makes him something 20 plus feet for sure. He's got a whip in his hand too, and his workers seem to be reporting, and in the middle there seems to be a water clock which seems to be measuring something like time that's passed. So maybe there's a, this whole thing of hours paid. Somebody's working for so many hours, they're getting paid to work, and the giant is a manager of this. So he's a big corporation boss as well. So it's not just a modern thing. Now, in the Gnostic Testament of Naphtali 1:24-27, the watchers are described as changing the patterns of religious worship and human social behavior, so that men worship the creation instead of the Creator. It says that sun and moon and stars change not their order, so should ye also change not the law of God in the disorderliness of your doings. So what the argument is that God has set everything in order from the cosmic, from the creation to the ways of man, so it's not right to change anything that God has put in place. The Gentiles went astray and forsook the Lord and changed their order and obeyed stocks and stones and spirits of deceit. But the testament of Naphtali continues, but ye shall not be so, my children, recognizing in the firmament and in the earth and in the sea and in all created things the Lord who made all things, that ye become not as Sodom, which changed the order of nature. In like manner, the watchers changed the order of their nature, whom the Lord cursed at the flood, on whose account he made the earth without inhabitants and fruitless. The Zoroastrian book of Zadspram describes how Satan tried to produce new creatures but produced degenerate ones instead. So this theme is repeated in different works. Now here's a picture of Father Crespi. His first name is Pedro. He died sort of 2003 or 4, I think. His Crespi collection contains a number of engraved stones, but he's got a really huge collection actually there. And it's now in a museum, as I mentioned. But on those stones, there's a number of engraved stones that show men riding on dinosaurs. Jubilees 7:24, which is quite similar to the Book of Enoch, says, "And after this, the giants sinned against the beasts and the birds and all that moves and walks on the earth, and much blood was shed on the earth. And every imagination and desire of men imagined vanity and evil continually." And we recognize these words. They're almost the same words as conclude Genesis 6 when God is about to destroy the world, because the thoughts of men are evil continually. Now, what exactly is meant by they sinned against the beasts and birds? Can it be that they created the dinosaurs, which, after all, turned out to be mainly bird-like in their biology? Well, here's another story that speaks of genetic tampering with creation. It's found in the book of the generations of Adam. Again, it's an extra biblical book, but it's available today to read it if you want to buy it just from the shops. The chief geneticist appears to be a female called Amma, and she's probably a giant. She creates all kinds of creatures, but in the end her creatures have the destruction of mankind in mind. Did she produce the dinosaurs depicted on the Crespi stones? The account also explains that it was her tampering that introduced a host of new sicknesses for mankind to deal with. The book of Generation of Adam, chapter 6, verses 1 to 5, and again it's chapter 6, it is in Enoch and it is in the Bible also, describes Amma, who created new forms of life dedicated to the destruction of mankind. Among our little ones who still remained with us was our son Timnor, who was blessed with great wisdom to understand the physical laws by which machines could be created and governed. Timnor's sister Amma was also blessed with understanding, for she investigated the nature of life and unlocked the mysteries of life itself. When Timnor was 18 years old, he took Amma, who was 15, as his wife. And that was quite young for those days. People used to marry sort of closer to 100. But anyway, although the Lord Jehovah had blessed these two greatly with wisdom and understanding concerning the secrets of his creation, they did not follow the ways of Jehovah their Elohim, for they took personal credit for their accomplishments, failing to acknowledge that the source of their power was in the heavenly realm. In the 100th year, Timnor and Amma led a group of our children who, like themselves, worshipped the workmanship of their own hands and the power of their minds out of the land of Canaan. They travelled northward to a valley that they denominated the land of Hana, or it could be Hana, meaning rebellion. Here we will cast aside the ways of our progenitors and follow our own wills, they declared. The people of Hana prospered in the land, building strong cities in which they dedicated themselves to the fulfillment of every physical desire. But their souls were empty because they did not know the Lord Jehovah, nor did they call on his holy name. Timnor built great engines with which to deface his mother earth, defiling her for his unholy purposes. With other machines of his contriving, his people flew through the air like birds and explored the depths of the lakes and rivers. So it seems he came up with planes and submarines. And this was written by somebody about 300-400 BC, so they certainly had never seen either of those things yet. That's pretty interesting. He also created great instruments of destruction with which his people attacked the people of Cain, driving them into the mountains and dense forests so that they could take their land for an inheritance. So they stole people's land with their technology. Sounds like the modern world. Thus did the evils of private ownership of land lead to war and destruction, in which one people would destroy another to inherit their land and their goods, and the God-given abilities of mortals were turned into instruments of death and destruction. And this is in an ancient book, it's not a modern commentary. Amma was not a bit behind her husband in creating wickedness, it continues, for she manipulated the very fountain of life until she had created new forms of beings dedicated to evil and the destruction of mankind. From then onwards, sickness and disease began to spread among mortals, bringing sorrow and death upon them. So this genetic manipulation is tied to human sickness, and that's pretty interesting. Now we look at the stone etchings from the Crespi collection, showing dinosaurs and giants together, which doesn't make any sense to most of us, but these are supposed to be proper, authentic race collections from Middle American times. We notice here what looks like a brontosaurus and then somebody basically jumping on its back with a spear or something in his hands. But the main point to note here is, knowing the size of a brontosaurus, which is about sort of 30 to 40 feet high, the giant behind them is of a similar height. If you think it's just a misrendering of the size of a human, then we have other ones that show, this is another giant, on this time it looks like a triceratops. He's got it on the back and he's got kind of a hatchet in his hand or something. Quite a good drawing, actually. It's quite clear what the animals are, and definitely that they are there in times of humanity, in human times, and in the time when the giants were around, which was between Adam and Noah, therefore about 5,000 years ago. And I'm showing 4 of them here, but he had more. Here we have a giant who seems to be fighting like a Tyrannosaurus Rex. And don't forget, none of these were walking around recently, of course, but these seem to be recollections of people who saw these things and were able to draw them. The giant again is as tall as a Tyrannosaurus. There's another one behind him, it seems, but he doesn't seem to be afraid. He's just getting stuck in. But it must have been terrifying if these dinosaurs were around when the giants were around, because people were also still around, and it seems that these dinosaurs were also attacking people because they also wanted to eat, just like the giants wanted to eat. Now the giants created them for their own food, but of course the dinosaurs had to find food as well, and of course human beings would be the obvious choice. Now here we have a drawing that shows a number of different dinosaurs. So unless they were digging them out of the ground themselves as archaeologists and reconstructing them in museums like we do, we can only conclude they actually saw the real thing walking around. You know, a real living memory, a real Jurassic Park. And I wonder if the people who made these movies actually knew about these drawings and these traditions, but maybe as part of secret society knowledge, and so we're able to tap on those things for their movie ideas. Now, even the giants needed continuing access to human genes, it seems, because perhaps they had flaws as well, and so they needed to stay viable as they bred and had their children. So it's possible that there was some kind of genetic manipulation, not just of animals, but even of humans, perhaps. Now, God destroys these early giants and their offspring, of course, using the mechanism of the flood of Noah. And then the spirits of these animals and of the giants departed from them. Now, the animals are earth-based, so they were able to sort of descend or go wherever they went. But the spirits of the giants were half heaven-based from their parentage, but also half earth-based, and they weren't really accepted in either realm. So as far as the writers are concerned, the disembodied spirits are wandering around in the spirit realm on the earth, unable to rest, repose in death, and they are the demons, which comes from daimonos in Greek, meaning demigods, half-gods, which means they're half-human as well, from Enoch 15. So it says in Enoch 15, to read it, and he answered and said to me, and I heard his voice, Fear not, Enoch, thou righteous man and scribe of righteousness. Approach hither and hear my voice, and go, say to the watchers of heaven, who have sent thee to intercede for them, they should intercede for men, and not men for you. Wherefore have ye left the high, holy, and eternal heaven, and lain with women, and defiled yourselves with the daughters of men, and taken to yourselves wives, and done like the children of earth, and begotten giants as your sons? And though you are holy, spiritual, living the eternal life, you have defiled yourselves with the blood of women, and have begotten children with the blood of flesh, and as the children of men have lusted after flesh and blood, as they also do who perish and die. Therefore I have given them, that is men, wives also, that they might impregnate them and beget children by them, that thus nothing might be wanting to them on earth. But you were formerly spiritual, formerly living the eternal life, and immortal for all generations of the world. And therefore I have not appointed wives for you, for as for the spiritual ones of the heaven, in heaven is their dwelling. And now the giants who are produced from the spirits and the flesh shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and upon the earth shall be their dwelling. Evil spirits have proceeded from their bodies, because they are born from men. Yet from the holy watchers is their beginning and primal origin. They shall be evil spirits on earth, and evil spirits shall they be called. As for the spirits of heaven, in heaven shall be their dwelling. But as for the spirits of the earth, which were born upon the earth shall be their dwelling. And the spirits of the giants, that is, the evil spirits, afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth, and cause trouble. They take no food, yet they hunger and thirst, and cause offences. So these spirits of the giants are still doing the same kinds of things the giants did in the past. They're causing a lot of trouble, and they're afflicting the spirits of men. And these spirits shall rise up against the children of men and against the women, because they have proceeded from them. So it's interesting that they lay an attack against women because they proceeded from them. It's almost like they're angry for having been born into the world and being condemned to the fate that they've received. And one can understand that, actually. It would be tough to be born a giant only to realize that you are a condemned and hated race, that you are neither one nor the other, heavenly or earthly, and that your spirit cannot rest. It's a terrible thought. I almost feel sorry for them, but unfortunately their nature is fixed by their pure genetics, so I suppose that feeling sorry for them is not going to achieve anything. But anyway, this is thought to be the theological justification given by Paul for why women should wear head coverings in church and in general. He said it is because of the angels. Now we have to read between the lines here, but it seems to be that it indicates to the angels that they are spoken for. They're not available to be taken, intimidated, affected. Even the spirits of the demons may have wanted to do what the giants did in their time, just grab free women for themselves. In this case, they might want to sort of possess them or torment them spiritually, and the covering is an indication to them as much as anybody else that they're not available. This whole legend of the angels and their giant children and their continued existence in the form of imprisoned angels and demon spirits seem to be quite real to the New Testament writers. We read in Jubilees 10:7-12, "And thou knowest how thy watchers, the fathers of these spirits, acted in my day. And as for these spirits which are living, imprison them and hold them fast in the place of condemnation, and let them not bring destruction on the sons of thy servant, my God, for these are malignant and created in order to destroy." So he's asking God to protect these people from these spirits and their malignancy, their bad character. So he's acknowledging that they're around, and then that we have to ask God to protect us from them. And let them not rule over the spirits of the living. So please, God, don't let them ruin our lives because of their malignancy. For thou alone canst exercise dominion over them, so we have to trust God to actually exercise protection for us. And let them not have power over the sons of the righteous from henceforth and forevermore. And the Lord our God bade us to bind all. So here we have, in a sense, in these scriptures, some of the commandments we see reiterated in the Gospels, that the disciples have to go and they have to bind the spirits. They have to stop them from operating. They have to forbid them from operating and cast them out of where they are operating, exercising authority against and over them. But this has been added to the authority that was given to Adam in the garden and that was given to Noah, because with the production of the giants in the pre-flood world, this was something else that had to be put into man's hand to enable him to regain authority over creation, this power over evil spirits. So here we see the basis for the authority that saints have been given over demons. This new power adds to the dominion first given to Adam, because the new situation needs a new kind of authority to be given to the saint, which is what I was just saying. Anyway, Phil, we've made it again. It's been another long session, and we will probably need to sit quite quietly after tonight to consider what we are really willing to believe, and if we do believe it, what we might have to change in our thinking and behaviour to accommodate this new truth. So much of the truth about the world we live in and its true history is almost too strange to tell or accept, So much of the truth of what is going on today in government laboratories is also too strange to tell or accept. Yet it is these facts that fill in the gaps in the picture we have of end-time events, because they give the apocalypse and the study of prophecy an ancient context. The fires of hell were added to the human curse as soon as angels became involved with the women. So when Adam and Eve fell, there was no hot fires of hell yet. It was just a curse on the earth that was waiting to be lifted. But once the angels got involved and the giants, there was now the promise of a fire to be lit in the abyss to destroy these spirits. And so the whole idea of hell was born from that. The promise of a Redeemer to Adam was not altered by this drama with the angels, however. The Redeemer now has to defeat the angels as well. That's the only problem. So Christ doesn't just die for human sin, but also to exercise authority over this race of spirits that is also in the world. And he has to cast out the spirits of these demon children as an additional burden on his ministry. And we know that Jesus also went about casting out demons, as well as teaching the truth about the kingdom of God and providing the great sin offering for mankind. His works would start the world back on a right path to God, and his doctrine would begin to renormalize the world spiritually. But for us, the great deception and lie, they still lie before us, and we're still dealing with it. Paul explains that it is every kind of lying wonder that we have to deal with right at the end of the age. So I hope that our topic tonight has served at least to prepare us for just about anything, because just about anything is going to happen. Well, thanks very much, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that there was some new stuff for you there, and that you'll go away and think about it and come back enthused next week when we continue with part 5 on the story of giants. Well, I don't think we'll try to tell you what we have next week. It's a mixture of things, but I hope we'll see you there. So until then, bye-bye, and thanks for coming tonight. Bye.